A new study suggesting that the climate is changing faster than we thought, and also they're now, it seems, figuring out what happened with this deadly Pacific heat wave that we had last summer, where here in Portland we had 116-degree weather for 3 days in a row. On the line with us is our old friend Dr. Michael Mann, the distinguished professor of meteorology, the director of the Earth System Science Center at Penn State University, member of the National Academy of Sciences, recipient of the Tyler Prize, author of several books, including The Madhouse Effect, and most recently, The New Climate War. Michael Mann with 2Ns.net is his website, and Michael E Mann with 2Ns is his Twitter handle. Professor Mann, welcome back to the program. To start out, this new study that suggests that some of the changes in the southern hemisphere that were predicted for 2080 are happening now. What's going on here?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. It's good to be back with you. And these are interesting studies. They really sort of reinforce something that many of us have been saying for some time, that, you know, the climate models aren't perfect. The critics love to point to uncertainties in the models as if they are a reason for inaction. But the reality is just the opposite, because as we learn more about the processes that play out in the climate system, we're encountering some surprises, and they're not welcome surprises. They are surprises that tell us, for example, that climate change is having some subtle impacts on the jet streams in both hemispheres, in the southern hemisphere, and that's what one of these studies is about, winter storms in the southern hemisphere that may be getting stronger for subtle reasons that aren't necessarily well captured in the climate models. And then in the northern hemisphere, we're talking about this Pacific heat dome, this Pacific Northwest heat dome that we experienced last summer. And now coming into the next summer, we can expect to see more of these sorts of events. And what this study, this latest study about the heat dome, tells us once again is there are some aspects of that event having to do with the very deep, high pressure that allowed for that heat and that record heat, and that high pressure was part of that event. That has to do with what's known as ridging in the atmosphere, the way that high pressures and low pressure centers cause wiggles in the jet stream, and those high pressure centers can get stuck in place. That ridge can be very persistent. That's what we saw with that heat dome event. And again, the climate models aren't necessarily really capturing the way that climate change is leading to these greater wiggles in the jet stream and these very persistent high and low pressure systems that give us these extreme summer weather events. Some of my own research over the last few years involves, again, an attempt to understand some of those processes that may not be very well captured in the climate models. And what that means is that we may be in store for more extreme weather than the models predict. I'll make one last point here. The warming of the planet is proceeding pretty much on pace, as the models predicted. The problem is some of the consequences of that warming are playing out earlier and quite profoundly, as we see with these examples.
So this means that, a few years ago we were talking about 2100 and the far, I won't live to see 2100. My grandchildren will, or hopefully, but I won't. And I think a lot of people were like, okay, let's do something about it, but let's not panic or freak out. I don't mean to say, is it time to panic and freak out, but are things happening much, much faster than we anticipated, just say 5 years ago?
Yeah, so again, the warming is pretty much on schedule. The models predicted that quite well. What we're seeing play out there is as predicted, and that's bad enough, because we're seeing the consequences of that warming now in the form of these extreme weather events that in many cases are more extreme than what the climate models predicted. The ice sheets, we're starting to see ice shelves collapse, Greenland, larger amounts of melting than we expected at this point. So there's the danger that the ice sheets begin to collapse earlier than we expected. They contribute to sea level rise earlier than we expected. So as I like to say, there is great urgency. If we continue to spew carbon pollution into the atmosphere and we continue to warm up the planet, we will see far worse consequences, and they will, some of those consequences will be locked in for the long term. There's no going back once we cross some of those potential tipping points with ice melt and other processes that sort of, once they kick into gear, they're hard to stop. And so what this tells us is that, look, we're seeing dangerous climate change already. We'll see far more dangerous consequences if we continue. Many of those consequences are tied to the overall warming of the planet. And the good news is that the models tell us we can basically stop the planet from warming up if we bring carbon emissions to zero quickly. And so that's what it's all about right now, getting off fossil fuels as quickly as possible.
To what extent, you mentioned the jet stream, or the jet streams, I guess, northern and southern hemisphere.
Yeah.
And that's, the atmosphere, the air around us. At the same time, we're seeing, the bleaching of coral reefs all around the world. The one in Australia, the Great Barrier Reef, is probably the most famous. And we're seeing changes in fisheries. We're seeing this out here in the Pacific Northwest as a consequence of both low oxygen areas that seem to have to do with temperature changes and just temperature changes themselves, where the fish are comfortable and not. And I guess we saw that some decades ago with cod on the Northeast. Correct me if I'm wrong. Where are these? What's the relationship between these two things, between the oceans warming and the air warming? And what do you think about some of the proposals that have been put together to for example, seed the ocean with tiny amounts of iron particles to pull carbon out of the ocean? And help restore some balance there, and ultimately perhaps pull that carbon out of the atmosphere as well.
Yeah, I mean, the oceans are really being subject to multiple insults. The rise in carbon dioxide is literally acidifying the oceans. And so we're seeing that ocean acidification threatening coral reefs, threatening shellfish in places like, as you say, off the west coast of the United States. And we are also seeing deoxygenation. As you warm up water, it can hold less dissolved oxygen. And that's a threat to the fish species, the marine life that occupy the world oceans. And so on top of that is the warming of the oceans as well, and that leads to coral bleaching. And so you've got sort of these multiple insults: ocean acidification, deoxygenation, and warming, and they're all tied together. They're all basically tied to the carbon pollution that we're pumping into the atmosphere. About 90% of the heating is going into the oceans. That's where most of the heat gets stored. So we pay a lot of attention to the oceans. And while surface temperatures fluctuate quite a bit, so not every year sets a new record for the surface temperature of the planet, every year does set a new record for the temperature of the oceans. It's a much more steady indicator of the warming of the planet. And look, we rely upon healthy oceans as a species. If we lose the oceans, then we're really in trouble. If we lose livable oceans that are plentiful with life, with marine life that provide food sources to now nearly 8 billion people on this planet. Clearly, there are scenarios where if we continue down this road, our future starts to resemble a dystopian future. The good news is that there is time to make sure that that's not our legacy. There is still time to reduce our carbon emissions so that our legacy is not to leave behind a damaged planet for our children's grandchildren.
And if you want to learn more about it, check out Dr. Mann's new book, The New Climate War. Professor Mann, thanks so much for dropping by. It's great talking.
Thank you. Always a pleasure, Tom.
Thank you. Back at you. Remarkable stuff.